Hey everybody, this is my third attempt trying to record the audio. I'm not sure what the issue's been, but nonetheless, here we go. Go Native typically was a group project. It's something I designed a little over 20 years ago, I'm almost embarrassed to say, with students when I was still a graduate student at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. Its initial intent was to be a group project, but now you guys are working on your own. However, I of course encourage and welcome you working completely, quietly, and independently by yourself for Go Native. However, you are welcome to invite people that are already in your immediate surroundings, family that you live with, for example. I don't want you to introduce anybody new to the equation for obvious health and safety reasons. But if you have a sibling, a loved one, somebody that's living in your immediate surroundings that you'd like to invite into the practice, I think that's completely acceptable. Just acknowledge them as you go forward with the project. The piece on the screen behind the text is a work by Agnes Denny's titled Wheatfield. It's on Manhattan. The piece was done in 1980, and this photograph was taken when the World Trade Center was still standing. Here's an aerial photograph of Agnes Denny's Wheatfield. This was on reclaimed land. It was a landfill a little bit prior to Agnes Denny's actually working with the property. Again, this is in the 80s. Property was still really expensive on Manhattan, but not like it is today. But the piece is really interesting for a couple of reasons. I love to see the natural world, or in this case, the agricultural world, kind of juxtaposed with that city surrounding. Also, the wheat that Agnes grew was used to actually feed some of the horses, I believe, for the mounted police in New York City. And the seeds were distributed through different entities and through exhibits all around the country after the fact. So this idea that this impermanent piece, this impermanent act, this rectangular brand of wheat on the earth was temporary in so many ways, but yet it did have a lifespan that moved on well beyond that. What we do with our land, how we organize it, what we prioritize, says a lot about who we are as a people. I think Agnes was definitely referencing this when she was researching her project. This particular photograph shows the Statue of Liberty in the background. Here's a photograph of Agnes standing almost waist deep in wheat field prior to its harvest in 1982. I think I was a little bit biased here. I decided to start this project lecture with Dennis's work for a lot of reasons. Right now, given that a lot of people are at home, we're picking up more domestic activities than we have before. I've noticed online a ton of people baking, and I've been working on a project with some folks in Sweden for almost 2 years now regarding baking bread. And since we haven't been meeting on campus, I've been occupying some of my free time with practicing baking sourdough. So when I started thinking about our project, I think I had Wheatfield on the mind for obvious reasons, since that's something I'm personally using. But I think it goes back to these ways of what's important to us is where we spend our time, how we feed our family, how we loved our loved ones. What do you do on your free time? What do you actually spend those hours, those minutes doing? Say a lot about what your true priorities are. And I think those things for a lot of us don't always line up. So this project will be kind of interesting as perhaps a way to pull you away from technology a little bit as you move on to your apartment balconies or your front yards, your backyards, maybe a loved one's farm property, or if you happen to have a really big field nearby or a park nearby. This project is going to be a good opportunity for you to spend some time outdoors in a natural setting and not just reflecting on it, but responding to it in a really proactive way. I hate to use this expression, but I would argue that Robert Smithson is one of the founding forefathers of earth art or earthworks, the way we look at it today. Earth art came about in the 1960s, and I think it was a direct response to a lot of things. One, in part, being minimalism. A lot of the earthwork you see is very much inspired by the same minimalistic works you see going on within the gallery and museum circuits. Smithson's quote, "A work of art, when placed in a gallery, loses its charge and becomes a portable object or surface disengaged from the outside world." As we move forward into trying to define what equates land art and all these sort of adjacent genres, I want you to think not just about how it's defined, but more importantly, why they were doing it. Why Did they remove work from the typical gallery museum scenarios? What were they fighting against? What were they curious about? What were they trying to change? If anything, over the years that I've learned about art history and design history is that our creative history tends to be that of a rebellion. It's responsive to the times that the work is being made in. And one generation rebels against the generation before. You guys, you'll rebel against what I teach, just how I've rebelled against what some of my professors taught me or my mentors instructed me on. Not only is that a reality that I think we kind of need to embrace this cyclical nature of revolution and rebellion regarding creativity, but I think it's something we welcome. At least those of us that survive in a good creative world, we welcome those sorts of rebellions. So I'll be curious to see how you take this chance to work outdoors and translate it into something new. I'd also pose to you that one of the reasons, in fact, that I think a lot of practitioners remove their work from this manicured gallery or museum setting was a very distinct rebellion against the commodification of the art object or the commercialization of the art world. These are things in a lot of cases that we're going to look at today that can't be bought. These things are not typically for sale. There might be artifacts of a project for sale. These artists still needed to eat. However, the act itself was ephemeral. It was temporary. It could not be bought. In the video screenings I sent you to watch, there's one small PBS documentary. It's about 9 minutes long, and then it's followed by a documentary titled Rivers and Tides by Andy Goldsworthy. After you watch those screenings, I think you'll have a good grasp on the kinds of things that equate land art, and it goes by a lot of different names. It's not uncommon to hear the phrasing earth art or earthworks. They all pretty much mean the same thing. And at the end of the day, it's works of art that tend to be outdoors made with natural materials. Pretty simple definition. Environmental and eco art, despite the fact that land art is a form of environmental art in most cases, I would say that environmental art has a bigger umbrella. It's a bigger umbrella term because there's a lot of indoor work or artwork that is not made with naturally grown things that would still equate environmental art. So understand that how we define language, they kind of have like flexible edges. If every word is a circle, it's surrounded by a soft perimeter that overlaps with other language. So it can't be resolute. Words evolve, texts evolve. One word I really want to focus on through the duration today is site-specific or site specificity. You may have heard me mention it earlier in the semester a couple of times, but I want to first define what site means, and site means a locale, a specific location, as in a site. Not as in vision, but S-I-T-E, as in geographic spot or a certain place. Now, when something is site-specific, all it means is that it's designed specifically for that site. That these works we're going to look at in reference to art and design, if we were to try and reproduce those works in a different location, they would have to change. They would no longer mean the same thing because the artist's intent pretty much across the board with most land artists is that they are site-specific. They're directly responsive to the landscape that they reside within. Plein air, really quickly, it's just a fancy French term meaning out of doors. Claude Monet, Vincent van Gogh, these artists went outside. They took their canvases, easels, and paints outside and painted in the open air. You essentially are kind of practicing a contemporary plein air experiment. I'm sending you outdoors, not just because it offers us free material and space we don't have access to typically, but moreover, it's going to give you hopefully an experience with wellness, getting you outside in the fresh air, in the sunlight, and maybe offering you a little bit of optimism in these difficult times. Ephemerality and temporalness, those are things you guys are, I think, pretty much really aware of already. We've spoken at them at length. Do remember the subtle differentiation between those two terms? Ephemeral specifically relates to impermanence, but it also references acts of decay or change, where temporal really specifically references the temporariness of something, but doesn't necessarily insinuate decay. And last on the vocabulary list for now is the term Anthropocene. This specifically relates to a geological age, the age we live in now, the age of man, and some would argue the end of our geological ages for man. Anthropocene references our impact on the climate, our impact on the Earth as a planet. A few tips as you move forward with your designs is to watch the weather. You've got a number of weeks, but you're also privy to the weather. One of the reasons I wanted to build in the extra time was so that you could respond to the weather. You may decide to do a project that actually embraces the rain if we have a long stretch of it. If things get really windy, you need to take that into account because your project might be extra ephemeral if it blows away before you can even complete it. So I would recommend starting early. I recommend taking pictures of the space that you're going to work in and maybe actually drawing right on top of those photographs. Those are things you can share with a Facebook group or send to me. I'm also happy to get little video tours from you of the areas you have to work in. So if you've got a small deck and you want to do something on that outdoors, send me some photographs, or let's schedule a short Zoom meeting and you can just kind of do a walking tour of your space for me. I'd also recommend hit up a few of your classmates for the same thing. I'm not the end all as far as opinions or advice here. I'd like to think I'm well prepared to offer a lot of assistance, but I also think it's important to get feedback from different people, and they don't even necessarily need to be fellow artists or designers. Everybody's opinion matters in these sorts of cases, as long as they approach the concept with an open heart. I'd also recommend you sit with your space. So if you have a park a few doors down from your home that's still open and you want to do something with the fallen branches there, go sit in the space. Think about it. If you've got a good yard with some good light or lots of leaves or flowers blooming or other material that you can use, maybe your family's got a little bit of farm property and there's some hay or some stone or some dirt and mud that's there ready for you to play with. I love the idea of you jumping in the deep end and getting to work quickly, but I also think it's equally important to let things gestate and to give yourself a little time to sit and just be with a space. It sounds a little cheesy. I suppose I'm coming off more as a hippie than I typically do. But actually to be with an area, to let it be your collaborator, to sit with a space and let it tell you what it might want to do, instead of working uphill, no pun intended, when you work with what a space already has to offer, I think you're going to have a more enjoyable creative process with a project like this. Also, gather up supplies. Think about the sorts of things you might need. I give a longer list on the assignment, but rakes, buckets, shovels, just basic stuff that you might have in your garage, in your shed, in your yard that could be helpful for you to work with. I'd suggest gathering up or at least taking a small inventory of what you have access to. Some of you may have a full shed of wonderful supplies and tools for you to use while you're working outdoors. Others, maybe not so much. So you're going to kind of have to roll with these punches because there's a disparity, unfortunately, between what we might have available. Protect yourself. Think about grabbing a hat, some sunscreen, some gloves. Do you need some knee pads? Do you have good footwear? What sorts of things do you need to be prepared for to work safely and comfortably outdoors? I know from my own experience when I've been going out to just even to pull weeds to get my garden ready for summer, I've been using muscles that I have not used since last summer. And for like several days after a bout of pulling weeds, I'm sore. So some of you might even want to stretch. Do take your body into account and work safely. If you're like me and you've got a bad back or bad knees or some sort of ailment, you're going to have to design around that. That's not just necessary. I think it's mandatory. You need to be good to yourself in order to sustain your practice. Last, I want you to photograph often. Maybe photograph the site before you intervene, photograph the project while it's in progress, and then photograph its final stages. That way, when it comes time to turn in your project and share some of the results in your process on Facebook with our group, you're going to have a plethora of images to draw from. I also say photograph often because even when it's all said and done, when you create something you love, some of you will photograph it in one session. You'll go out there for 20 minutes, you'll take pictures, and you'll think you'll be done. I would suggest perhaps photographing at sunset, at sunrise, at different times of day, from different perspectives. Walk all around the piece. Get down on your knees, stand up on a ladder, get really close to the work, walk a fair distance away. Take some time and think about how your documentation helps or hinders your outcome. Because for temporary and ephemeral work such as this, they only live on through the documentation. So we need to be good at record keeping. You guys have already heard me go off on diatribes about this all semester long. I do it for lots of reasons, not just because it makes my life easier as the person grading the work. It makes your future easier if you keep a portfolio of all your experiments along this creative path that you're walking. Really quickly, let's look at a little bit of the impact that man has had on the landscape. We make dramatic changes. This is an image of strip mining. Strip mining and sort of this strata, this cut into the earth segmentation, is actually a really big inspiration for a lot of artists, including Robert Smithson, who I quoted earlier in the lecture, with whom I'll show some other artworks of before. Now, we might look at this and see something really tragic and sad, but I also find it strangely really beautiful. This act of terracing, it's so architectural. It does have aesthetic merit despite the tragedy and the impact that it has on the land. Logging, slash and burn farming techniques. Right now, we've been experiencing a lot of temperature and humidity changes in different parts of the globe. California, not exempt, of course. I'm sure you've all heard about the different forest fires and things happening there. But I'll also add in the leadership and the administration in countries like Brazil and other countries that have part of the Amazon forest in it that are burning down like large segments of land so that they can grow food and farm cattle. I've always been really drawn to the sublime or the sublimity of these atomic explosions. The test explosions in particular, when lives were not lost, I've always found extremely attractive. For some reason, the shape of a mushroom cloud is really interesting. But then also the sad duality of knowing that there could be so much death attached to this impact that we have caused on our land. And it's not just these initial explosions, it's the aftermath. If my memory serves me, I believe this is a World War II aerial photograph of a town being bombed. Intermittent between the smoke, between these clouds, you can see these little cut plots of land, almost like a quilt, where agriculture was taking place. Going through middle school and high school, the US was really active in Iraq with Desert Storm. This is a National Geographic photograph of an oil field on fire. This was in the 90s, if memory serves. These kind of impacts that we have, both large and small, I do think inform our visual vocabulary as we move into a project like this. Artists and designers, when their creativity is handled well, they're naturally distilling the time that they live in. They're naturally digesting what's going on in the world surrounding them, and it comes out in their work. Whether they intend it to or not, it just sort of is this presence that's almost unavoidable. And these are a few of the things that made up people in your teacher's generation. War with Iraq, invasions abroad. We've also had some really aesthetically beautiful and mysterious footprints, architectural footprints on the landscape. We've undertook really large exercises in wanting to be remembered and wanting to have a legacy. This is Stonehenge in the UK. Now, when we see arrangements like this, things that we would argue as prehistoric, these are really intentionally organized things. And one form you'll notice that reoccurs a lot is this basic geometric form of a circle. A lot of the land artists beginning in the 60s used the circle a lot, but we can look back in art history for examples of this, particularly in ancient Greece and ancient Egypt. I don't think there's a continent that you don't find tons of circular or spherically inspired design or artistic forms. What is Stonehenge for, anyhow? It's argued a bit in history. It could be related to ceremonial or ritualistic things of some sort of worship or space for worship. It's also argued that it has calendar attributes, that somehow it's marking passages of time. In the case of the pyramids at Giza, we're looking at very large-scale tombs. These are satellite photographs of the Great Wall of China. Walls like this were meant to protect people from invading, but also maybe to keep people from leaving. There's other contemporary artwork that's actually happened on and around the Great Wall of China. And I think one of my favorites that I believe I mentioned earlier in the semester was by Marina Abramovic and her partner Ule. They were a pair of performance artists that worked together in the late 60s, 70s, and 80s. Marina is still alive and working. They have, of course, since parted ways. And when they broke up, they decided to have this like wonderfully performative breakup where they started walking towards each other from either side of the Great Wall of China. And when they met, they said goodbye and they turned and walked away from one another. How's that for a breakup? Look at other ways we've just organized civilization as a species. This is an image, a National Geographic image of Machu Picchu in Peru. What does landscape mean, anyhow? I don't want to take any term for granted, and I hope you won't mind if I dork out a little bit here. But landscape, if we divide the term, and of course, land is inherent, earth is inherent. But if I was to like lean forward and whisper the word landscape into your ear, the visual that it might conjure up is probably going to be a painting, something idyllic, beautiful, pastoral. When we think of a landscape, I think we think of something beautiful. We think of a scene, almost as if we're seeking out in our mind's eye a crop through the lens of a camera. But the word scape suggests an action. So landscape inherently suggests man's manicuring, perhaps, of the land, because we're scaping that land. With that, and in all seriousness, I had to throw in a couple images of some crop circles. I totally believe in aliens, guys. However, I just don't believe these crop circles was made by aliens. I think they probably have better things to do. With that, though, I want you to daydream a little bit on like how these things might have been made. A lot of cases, it was made by a singular person or multiple people. A lot of times coming out in the quiet of night, trying to kind of fool a community or a geography that this was in fact done by other beings, otherworldly beings. Yet we've also arrived back at these circular forms, how common they are. What are those little baby circles to the kind of like 2 o'clock position of this larger circle? Were those test pads? What happened there? Of course, I don't want you to damage property, to damage crops, to ruin your yard, so you need to decide how heavy a footprint you enter into this project with. Now, on to some of the most iconic works of earth art. This one by Walter Di Maria, one of my favorites, was done in 1977. Sadly, that was in fact the year I was born. It's titled Earth Room. This one is at the Diaz Center for the Arts. It's about on the 4th floor of a building in New York City. It was the 3rd iteration of the piece. I believe there was 2 other earth rooms prior to this that happened in Germany. Don't quote me, but I think one was in Munich and one might have been in Berlin. Now, we do consider this a work of land art, and it's at least discussed in those circles. It is a lot of earth brought into the space. Now, we don't know where Di Maria got the earth. It's speculated he went to Pennsylvania and then brought it in. I always wondered if he was faking this or not, and I did a little more additional research on the work. And it is truly 22 inches deep of earth. Now, I want you to think a little bit. You get into an urban building. You're in one of the busiest cities in the world, New York City. You get into the building, you take the stairs or the elevators up several floors. The doors open, and you're confronted by this glass retaining wall, and you see the earth stacked up beyond it. I also want you to kind of think about what the smell might be, how humid that air might be. The person that caretakes for this work, if memory serves, his name is Bill Dilworth, something to that effect, and he's there to answer questions, and he gives tours to people that visit the work. But also once a week, he rakes and waters this installation. Me being of pretty practical sorts, I wonder what sort of plastic or sealants they had to put down underneath all this earth. What sort of rot might happen or damage to the building happens over these decades that earth room has been installed. This is a closer view, but this is actually a detailed image of one of the ones in Germany that preceded the 1977 one I just showed. You'll probably think I'm a little bit silly, but I find this gorgeous. I think I've been at home alone too long, y'all. Another work of lightning field essentially results in this drawing in space. And you can look up online better images than this. This is pretty pixelated. Um, it's harvesting lightning. It's partnering with nature. I wouldn't go as far as to say controlling, but would you say that the piece collaborates with nature? Can you do something that truly embraces the ephemerality and temporariness of you working on your property? If we have a lot of rain, is there a way that water can become an important component? Besides photographing your work, will you need to be taking any video? Do you take the video just walking through informally as a tour, or do you figure out a way to prop your phone to take a more professional video? Let's look at a few more temporal sorts of activities that might serve as inspiration for us. Zen rock gardens. Zen rock gardens are essentially meditative activity for the monks or the individual that is doing the raking, that's doing the pattern making. You guys are probably not going to have property that's full of stone, but you might have some areas that could be helpful. But I would point out the relationship with mark making like this to maybe even what we do when we mow the lawn. If you have a lawn, maybe you're the one in charge of mowing it, who knows? Are you willing, is your family willing to let you take a little bit of liberty with the pattern making and the landscaping that happens right now? So I want to point out Buddhist sand paintings. Sand paintings in general, it's not something exclusive to Tibet, India, or Nepal by any means. Native Americans do a similar version, and theirs is also circular in nature as well. I'm really curious about this popularity, this omnipresence of the circle and spherical forms in our design and in our art practices that have evolved independent from one another across the globe. These circular mandala paintings superseded the knowledge of Native Americans doing something similar. So where does this arise from? Is it something internal, something guttural? Or is it information we carried with us as man was nomadic and traveled and moved? Did the circle as this sort of perfect form in nature and in the world, supersede everything else when we were looking at the visual world? Now you can see fingers being dragged through the colored pattern sand painting here of the mandala. The mandalas, I'll point out, they're usually done in 8 parts, 8 segments, almost like 8 pie pieces design-wise. And that's specifically referencing the 8-fold path to enlightenment that Buddhists follow. Acknowledging this lack of permanence is something really integral to a lot of older cultures on the planet. The Buddhist monks, they sort of ceremonially sweep up, and I think they burn the sand after the painting is done. Now, when monks install these sand paintings on the ground in the Western world, they might sit up on display for some time, but their initial purpose was meditative. It was kind of a version of worship. Now, in direct contrast to a lot of this, but equally meditative, is the work of Andy Goldsworthy. I sent you his documentary, Rivers and Tides, that I want you to watch. The links I sent you were in 2-part, but if for some reason you have difficulty getting those links to work, just look up Rivers and Tides. There's been several kind of bootlegged versions posted on YouTube and stuff. I wanted to give you free resources. I didn't want to require you guys to have to pay for anything, so it's been me looking for active links. Andy Goldsworthy is from the UK. He was born in 1956 and is very much still alive and working and traveling the world. Currently resides with his family in Scotland, and a lot of his work is in Scotland. But since he travels, he's made it a point to keep a certain degree of purity within the mediums he chooses. In this particular circular work we're looking at, if my guess is correct, I suppose he's dug a hole, a relatively deep hole, even if narrow. It's pretty deep, but deep enough so that the camera would be able to turn it into just sort of complete blackness. And he's centrifugally organized in this pattern around it, leaves of fall, moving from yellow to orange to red and to maroon. This gradient isn't anything artificial. He's just been really patient in the collecting and arrangement of the leaves. So your projects, they might not at first glance seem like they weren't being done, but think about the time spent. I think to do this project right, it's going to take you guys being patient. Patient not just with the daydreaming and brainstorming parts of the design, but patient in the execution and equally patient with the documentation. So kind of look at this as a trifecta in that respect. This work, same kind of organized gradient from a bright yellow to a slightly darker yellow and then an almost lime green or chartreuse and then back into the darker greens. These are leaves that have been wet in the river and slapped onto the surface of the rock. In the video that you guys will be watching on Goldsworthy, if you haven't watched it already, you'll see this piece or a piece like it as it dries out, as it dehydrates, that the leaves blow away. So it does have a lifespan. And I point that out specifically because I want to think about how your piece is going to evolve. You may do something really stunning, beautiful, and perfect, but one gust of wind could come along and ruin it. There's a moment in the documentary that you guys will see where Goldsworthy, he kind of starts cussing because the wind starts blowing as he's doing a piece suspended from a tree. Hey, shocker, it's another circle. This is also by Goldsworthy. You'll see similar works in the documentary. I want to challenge you guys on a couple of levels. First, you're working on the ground, but can you work off of the ground? What sorts of height, negative space, and interest can you get if your piece happens to be able to attain some posture, a little bit of height? Some of you may do some really beautiful things that kind of hug the earth that are much lower. And I don't want to devalue that, but that's only one option. So do remember some of those early conversations we had during the tactile handheld about positive versus negative space, how to take advantage of negative space. Remember, sculpture inquiries don't exist without the negative space surrounding them within the air. In the case of this circle, he's created the circle by leaving a central area completely open, so you actually see through it like a portal or a window. The subtle directionality of these twigs, too, almost infers the piece has like a forward momentum that it could start rolling like a very manicured, organized tumbleweed. Ice that Goldsworthy kind of cracked and pulled off the top of a pond. It's got a really narrow footprint and it catches a little bit of air. I think the piece is a foot or two tall, if memory serves. Now, Goldsworthy, again, he's very much a purist. He works seasonally. In other words, he's working with what's available in a particular season. So if it's fall, he's going to take advantage of fall colors and fall leaves. If it is winter, he's going to take advantage of ice. Summer, he's going to take advantage of green. So there's these kinds of things I want you to think about as you move forward to acknowledge. You've got a couple of weeks, but that time will go by really, really quickly. So it probably would behoove you guys to run some tests and definitely walk your spaces, walk your property, whether that be a really great balcony off of an apartment, a front yard, backyard, or other larger property. Now, these leaves of Goldsworthy, they almost appear to have been embossed. I don't know what the substrate or that armature could be behind the form. And it is a piece that's on the ground. It's hugging the ground. But he still has a beautiful photo of it. For Goldsworthy, it's the photos that tour in a lot of cases. It's the photography that's shown of the work after the fact. It's the coffee table books that he and his publisher create based off of the work. Now, he does take some of the outdoor materials inside gallery spaces and museum spaces as well, but you need to think about the diversity or the way that his work survives after the fact. Ana Mendieta, the Silhouetta series. Ana is a Cuban-born artist. She immigrated to the US at the young age of 12 on her own without her parents. A lot of her work was about missing home, about missing the landscape of home, but she was also looking at issues in feminist history and what nature's perception of femininity was. A lot of times we talk about nature as in Mother Nature. We feminize it. We deem it as woman because of the fertility aspects, because we're watching things grow and women are the gender that bears children. on a biological level. So I think these assumptions, they're old. They're tens of thousands of years old with the way we evaluate our landscape. And she's kind of hearkening into that. A lot of the work she's doing nude in this particular piece, it's the photograph that survives. I would say and argue that a lot of these are performative, or they seem almost haunting or ghost-like in their performance qualities. Another Ana Mendieta piece where the silhouette has been dug into the earth. In this case, the same shape with those arms upright. Those arms upright for what reason? I'm not sure. Are they upright in reverence? Are they upright in fear? Are they upright in worship? This becomes an effigy, her form, her silhouette being burned. Mendieta's silhouette, her literal physical self here, with material growing out of it. Weeds, plants that have been pulled and tucked in between her legs, between her sides and her arms. And another where her physical self is not present. Now, when these pieces happen, sometimes there's an audience. Sometimes there's more than just her there to see it, but usually not many people, just a couple of individuals. She unfortunately died pretty young. Anya Mendieta was actually married to Carl Andre, who was one of the artists featured in the last article that you guys read. Carl Andre was a 1960s minimalist. Anna lived from 1948 to 1985. She referred to a lot of her works as earth body works or female body and nature works. They were conceptualized for the natural environment. Unfortunately, her death was surrounded by a lot of mystery and rumors. It is speculated pretty heavily that Carl Andre killed her. Mendieta fell to her death from the 33rd floor of her apartment building, and Carl Andre was the only one there, and he was actually tried for her murder but was acquitted. On that sad note, her pieces start to take on kind of this grave appearance, as if she was sort of memorializing herself or memorializing other people lost. Another famous earthwork artist, land artist, is Richard Long. His work has both performative ramifications. They exist in very desolate, isolated places. This one is a line in the Sahara. But he also will sort of excise or take abbreviations from the landscape, not unlike Robert Smithson, and actually install them in gallery spaces. This is another work by Richard Long. Now, that circular design is created by the pulling of weeds and the picking up of rocks from strategic locations. So it's kind of like you guys in a drawing class using your eraser to erase out the drawing from a charcoal covered piece of paper versus using the charcoal to make the drawing. What kind of positive, negative play with space can you have on your yard? What if you mow your yard selectively? I doubt your family would be really happy with that, but I think it'd be kind of a funny approach. What if you pull weeds selectively, clean selectively? This is an example of Richard Long's work at a museum. This is actually on the rooftop of a museum, so he's taken part of the outer world's landscape and brought it into this manicured, man-made world of the museum. Christo and Johnny Claude created this work called Running Fence. This is white polyester fabric that extends through miles of farmland, through pasture land in California. So there's a lot of cattle grazing here, if I remember correctly. Now, Christo and Johnny Claude have a really interesting practice. His partner, Johnny Claude, has since passed, but I believe Christo is still alive, and I think he might still be working. But these large-scale temporary public sculptures, they didn't have public sponsorship in the traditional sense. So what Christo and Johnny Claude would do is make these drawings, make all these plans and proposals that would then be sold so they could afford to subsidize their own projects. I really love that as a model because what it offers local communities is new money. When they decide to do a large scale work like running fence or a few of the others that I'll show you, they're introducing new cash to the community that they're working with. And they also hire locals to help them execute the work because they're, of course, not working alone when it's this large. But I do want to point out the administrative nightmare, all the permits, all the collaboration, all the permissions that need to be given before they can embark on the work. Christo and Johnny Claude's wrapped trees. I love this shot of the sun setting behind the one on the left. And the one on the right, I actually sometimes show in my drawing classes. When students go outside to draw for the first time, and if any of you are in a drawing class, you'll probably be assigned that while we're on quarantine. When you go outside to draw, it's really hard to kind of examine what the overall shape of a tree is, like you would with a typical still life, because it's so upstaged by all the little individual leaves kind of blowing in the wind. But if when you're evaluating the world as a drawer, as a printmaker, as a painter, as somebody that just enjoys making a visual image, see how you can kind of boil down those images in different ways. And I love returning back to Christo's wrapped trees for that. This is the Point Neuf wrapped bridge in Paris. Again, more nylon. It's a kind of polypropylene fabric that's used to wrap the bridge. And if you look closely, you can see the cordage, the rope that's used to kind of batten down that fabric to help reveal some of the shape of what's underneath. This is a nice example of one of their drawings that they would use to sell to help fundraise to create the projects. Now I want you to notice the dates, 1975 to 1985. The piece was probably only up for 14 days. I think most of their work averaged a few days to 2 weeks, no more than a month in most cases, because of the potential environmental impact. The fact that a lot of the pieces had to be staffed, they caused increased traffic in those areas, and they age, like the fabric doesn't stay clean enough for long enough. So these are short-lived projects in the physical side. However, they can take years and years to get to a point where they're actually executed. Back to that whole need of making applications and proposals and acquiring local permits and finding contractors willing to help them execute the work. Because this much fabric, to unfurl it over a bridge, that takes a whole ton of investment from the local community. And I don't mean financial, but I mean time. So Christo and Johnny Claude's fundraising efforts, I think, are really important to acknowledge here. Completed image of the wrapped bridge. Now, Johnny Claude headed up this piece on the Biscayne Bay Islands off the coast of Miami. I think there's about 12 of them that they wrapped, and these are just small little islands, unoccupied, at least at the time that it was done. You can see the time frame, 1980 to 1983. So 1980 is from the moment of conceptualization and from the time that they started to try and acquire approval. This piece was only up for a short period of time, but it was really controversial, and I think rightfully so. But let's unpack that just a little bit. So what we're looking at is 12 small islands. We see 3 of them in this particular photograph that are wrapped in this pink polypropylene fabric. The fabric is floating on top of the water, and of course that is going to cause some environmental damage to what would be below, to fish life, to algae that fish might be feeding on. So at its very nature, it is problematic. And I do think that there's been some protests and arguments surrounding Christo's work, if I remember correctly from my own education in school. However, I'd also point out some of the hypocrisy. A lot of folks that might have had problems with Christo and Johnny Claude's work didn't know about their investment in the local economies, that they hired locals. They also didn't know that Christo and Johnny Claude were very much known for leaving spaces they worked in cleaner than how they found them. So the aftermath is typically cleaned up better. So trash on the edge of these islands was removed and all that kind of stuff throughout the duration of the project. I like the fact that there is room for argument. I like the fact that art can both upset and empower. I like the fact that we debate these sorts of things because I think it really reveals our own value systems and moreover, maybe our even personal hypocrisies. You know, to argue about this polypropylene blocking UV light for the fish underneath, I completely agree with, and I don't think I could have done the piece because of that personally. But we're also sitting here drinking on beverages that are coming from plastic bottles and have disposal rates beyond any other country. We have a lot of food waste. is kind of this, I don't know, it's a tit for tat. It's a bit of a problem when we're evaluating works such as this. It almost becomes like a present that's being unearthed. It's like a renaissance. When Christo and Johnny Claude talk about it, I threw this quote in the notes here if you're interested. It says, "Revelation through concealment was the couple's artistic approach. Once covered, even the most familiar objects become something else. Ultimately, Christo and Johnny Claude's wrappings reveal the essence of the object. When they completely enveloped the Reichstag in fabric in 1995, it was impossible to see the building's small sculptures, columns, arches, moldings, and other details. Only the sleek architectural form of the imposing monument remained, its very essence. Wrapping also challenges our relationship to the concealed object and opens our eyes to what is right in front of us. It lets us take a fresh look of things. Christo and Johnny Claude often reiterated that their work's sole purpose was to bring beauty and joy. Now, I love this description of the project, but when they argue that its sole purpose is to bring beauty and joy, I can get down with that. I do find the wrapped objects pretty. They're not going to be found pretty by everybody, but I find them beautiful. However, that argument, it's a little hard for me to digest. This project was first proposed, they started planning it in 1971, and they didn't manage to get permissions and everything in line to actually do the project until 1995. That's like a long time in progress. With that, though, to say it's only about beauty and joy when it's the Reichstag, that's kind of counter to the choice of that as a building. I think the artists full well knew that this was going to be an undertaking that kind of was a renaissance for that building, a renaissance for that space. If you look online, and I'll probably share some on the Facebook group, there's some really beautiful time-lapse videos of them actually doing the wrapping, of the folks in Germany contracted to drop this fabric. And I love this aerial shot because it shows how very large that structure actually is. Now, on the more difficult side of things, I'm throwing a Smithson slide in here right smack dab in the middle to be a bit weird and hopefully maybe even make you a little angry. This piece, titled Asphalt Rundown, simply consists of a truck backing up to the edge of this quarry, as in stone quarry, and dumping its asphalt payload down the edge. In the past, I've had students get a little bit mad or ruffled over this project, but let me see if I can do it justice explaining it. Because I hated it at first too, so I love sort of thinking back to where my mindset was when I was still in school. Now, for Asphalt Rundown, this stone quarry, it was a marble quarry in Rome, Italy. Now, if we look at our history, we can't help but think about marble statues, figural statues that come out of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. If I said, name the top 10 sculptures you can think of historically, those would be a couple of the few that we would get to pretty quickly. With that, though, what the heck does this mean, Asphalt Rundown? Again, it's a stone quarry, a quarry where cultural objects were made from. The stone was harvested from, cut from this territory, but it left a pretty big damage, a pretty big bruise on the landscape, and this asphalt almost looks like a wound or a scar on its edge. The asphalt rolls pretty slowly down the hillside, so if you're interested, you can look up Smithson's website and click on the link. Smithson's estate runs the website. He's long since passed. He died fairly young in a plane crash of a plane, if I remember correctly, he was piloting. He also was a pilot. You may have heard the phrase before that all roads lead to Rome. What does that mean? When I think of a phrasing of all roads lead to Rome, I think about the literalness of it, that if you look at aerial views of Rome, all the roads lead there. Well, why? It was an empire. It was one of the biggest empires known to mankind ever in history. Its reach was long, therefore its roads stretched long, and they all arrived back at Rome. Rome collected materials, people, goods, slaves from all over the place, and brought them into and out of Rome, back and forth, using roads. So when I think about its history, its reach, both cultural and political and governmental, when I think of our own political system still being based on Rome history, Rome democracy, or supposed democracy in some people's opinions, The idea of taking a material like asphalt and letting it roll down the hillside of a stone quarry that many of our most famous, revered works of art were potentially pulled from, I think is pretty interesting. And hopefully that gives you a little patience for a project like this that at first glance is nowhere near as sort of beautiful the outcomes of some of the other land art that we've been looking at. The work of Michael Heiser's, very much about what's not there. Within these cliff sides across from each other, you can see where there's been stone pulled from one side, but if you look across, it's also been removed from the other half. Heiser's quoted as saying, art had to be radical, it had to become American. You know, art and design have a really long history. And there's several genres America can kind of stake some claim to. Earth art and land art, really, in a lot of ways, as far as our interpretation of it from the 1960s, did get its start in the United States. I'd say quilt making, as well as a lot of music history, also got its start in the United States. So, really thinking about where history came from. In your art history classes, you'll have to memorize dates, genres, names of artists, the countries they're from, and the titles of famous pieces. But I think, as importantly, understanding where they plug into a bigger timeline will help you do better in your art history studies in general, and just be better evaluators of the visual world around you. Because a visual artifact, whether it's 2D, 3D, or 4D, it has a history, it has baggage of its own that can be unpacked. Looky there, another circle. This piece called Spiral Jetty by Robert Smithson consists of about 7,000 tons of rock and dirt trucked out into the spiral form in the Great Salt Lake in Utah. Now, if you know anything about the Great Salt Lake, it's devoid of most life because of the salt content. It can't have traditional fish life survive in the water. This piece, Spiral Jetty, I think it existed the way it looks here in this photograph for about 3 years before the waters began to rise. Because of changes in the climate, the water level moved above Spiral Jetty, and this is a pretty gorgeous photograph of the water levels being a lot higher. You can make pilgrimages here. I think this is also under the care of the Dia Center, just like Earth Room by Walter D. Maria. And another piece that I'm going to show you is also under the care of Dia. The piece does still survive. So when I was in undergrad in the mid-90s, it revealed itself, but this time encrusted in salt. Its surface almost looks like something you'd find in a cave. I actually find this version 30-some years later more gorgeous. I wonder how much the artist was aware of the potential changes that would ensue with his project. Smithson wasn't alive to see its reemergence. Here's an aerial photograph. I think this work stuck with me for a lot of reasons. Of course, you know, anything you learn when you're in high school and college in particular, they become these sort of like landmarks of your changes, of your maturity in your education. But for me, this piece reemerging when I was in undergrad, it was on the cover of a magazine I subscribed to, Sculpture Magazine, and they showed this white encrusted spiral shape. Now, in art history, the spiral form, just like the circle form, does reference the cycle of life, lifespan, being birthed and dying. It exists like that in ancient Greece. It exists that way in South America. It exists that way in ancient Egypt. And I wonder, again, back to how much these different cultures, these different peoples knew of the visual culture of other people on different continents and different places. We were not in a globalized situation where the exchange of information was available. So to see these kind of visuals evolve independently on different continents, potentially unbeknownst to one another, is fascinating. Spiral Hill in Holland. And here's a little drawing of Spiral Hill before it was made by Smithson. So when I encourage you to maybe do a little bit of sketching, I really do mean it. And share those sketches with me. I am going to want to hear from each of you in some fun way about what your intents are, what you're working on before you finish the project. I will reach out and have a couple of Zoom meetings next week where you guys can come in and a few of us can meet at a time. I'll probably keep it to 4 to 5 students at a time. That way you can maybe hear where each other's working, what your work is about, what materials you intend on working with. That way you can get some feedback, not just for me, but maybe for some peers. And ideally feel a little less alone since we haven't gotten a chance to work face to face for quite some time now. James Turrell, this piece called Light Rain, that oval opening in the ceiling of that space is open air. So if it rained, it would rain into the space. You can see a person sitting on a bench at the low point in the photo. I love Turrell's work. He's a bit of a mystery and elusive in a lot of ways. I think I showed you pictures earlier this semester of light changing pieces that he installed in the Guggenheim in New York, which is that spiral building designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. Now, in this particular installation of James Turrell's, it's also open air. It's a circular ocular opening in the ceiling. And as daylight moves, you can see that circle move along the walls. As weather changes, you experience in the space since it's open air. I had a chance to sit in one of his works, very similar to the one you're looking at. It's actually a really, really moving experience because I was in that neighborhood all day long. They have a piece like this installed in Pittsburgh on the property of the Mattress Factory. So if you ever get a chance to go to Pittsburgh, hit up the Mattress Factory, and I think this piece still exists there. You can go inside and actually sit with it for some time. And I was able to hang out with it in the early morning. And then when the museum opened, the Mattress Factory opened, I was able to go back inside the piece in the late afternoon. And then I was able to visit it again in the evening. And at every point of the day, the piece was completely different. The color was completely different. The sky that it was framing while you looked upwards was completely different. One of Turrell's most massive undertakings that's been going on for decades is called Roden Crater. This is in Arizona. It's an impact crater that, very similar to the pieces I just showed you, he's trying to take advantage of the ocular opening that you look up into when you're inside the impact crater. So they've created passageways that go through the sides of the crater walls that you get to walk through. And once you get inside, you look upright and revealed is this huge, large circular opening framing the sky. It's like the previous project I showed, but on steroids. This is miles. The amount of scale involved with so many earthworks. I have to bring up this notion of ego again. It is a very wonderfully kind of American thing that we think highly enough of ourselves that we're going to create this work that's just so giant, that's so huge. I've always wanted to go and visit Roden Crater. Here's a model of it from 1985. And it took decades for the piece to be completed. And I think there's still aspects of it that are underway, but it was private for so long. I think now the public can buy tickets to get in, but the tickets were like thousands of dollars. And that's not something that I'm willing to pay. I would love someday to perhaps teach a class or take a field trip with a group of students where we pick out 3 or 4 famous earthworks in the US and kind of make pilgrimages to each one. And then when we arrive back, we would maybe work together to create our own. The work I'm going to end with today is by Maya Lin. This is a Vietnam Veterans Memorial on the Mall in Washington, D.C. I wanted to end here because this is a piece that some of you've likely seen it before, but a handful of you, I have no doubt, have actually visited the piece in person. Now, Maya Lin was just a student when she proposed this project. And if you remember, it's a stone wall with the names engraved on the surface of those that were lost during the Vietnam War from the American side. This small little pastel drawing is what Maya submitted when she was a graduate student in architecture at Yale for this competition. Those that were in charge of creating the memorial for the Vietnam vets lost at war had a national competition, and they were receiving entries from all over the place. They had hundreds of them to go through. And Maya Lin's kind of quickly rose to the top, but it was so simple. She barely got in on time, and there's actually some really good documentaries about this particular project from beginning to end and about Maya Lin's work if you're interested. Maya Lin was born and raised in the Athens, Ohio area. Her father was a ceramicist. She comes from a really creative family. I think she had a brother that was a poet. And as I mentioned, she was just a student at Yale when she received the award to do this commission. She almost didn't get her proposal in on time, so it was extra surprising when she got the phone call that she received the award. She also unfortunately received a lot of criticism because of her Chinese heritage. She received letters, death threats, a lot of racial slurs were slung her way, um, strictly because of her Asian heritage. And a lot of the vets and people across the country protested the work. If you've ever had a chance to visit the piece, you're confronted by all the names of those that are lost. A lot of people take rubbings, so they take a little tracing paper and a little bit of graphite, and they can actually take a rubbing of the loved one's or family friend's name that was lost. Now, finding people's names, she organized that a bit differently. When you arrive at the center of the monument, there's a book that you can open up to find the name of your loved one, to find out what panel that they're on. Because Maya Lin chose to do this project chronologically. So the first name listed to the last name listed, they go in order by year. This kept it from being alpha hierarchied. Nobody would have wanted to go to a monument to find their family's John Smith in another sea of other John Smiths and James Smiths and Jim Smiths. This alleviated some of that stress by working with it chronologically and kept it a bit more special, kept it a bit more serene. Last slide for today. Physically, the monument was arranged a lot differently, and Maya took great care to keep this accessible for people that were visiting. A lot of vets coming home, they were wounded. Some of them were even in wheelchairs. So to be able to visit the monument, because it's formed in this apex, 2 ramps, one going down and one coming out. It's literally like you're visiting them in the earth, and then you get to kind of resurrect and come back out. And you can see the Washington Monument in the background. I wish you each luck with the Go Native. I look forward to beginning to speak with some of you next week and early into the week after. I would encourage you to take photos, draw, sketch, take many videos. Let's get together and talk about your plans. Reach out to your classmates in the Facebook group to have some meetings with them. Those can be on your own. I don't need to be included in those meetings, but I would encourage you to do them just the same. Post your in-progress works, the pictures of the sites that you guys are going to work, to the Facebook group, and that's another way to get some additional feedback. And I will award some extra participation points for people doing that. And I hope those of you that see photos posted of works in progress will chime in and offer some advice. Don't just pat somebody on the back and say they're doing great. We're all doing okay. You guys have been troopers through this. But I still want you thinking critically about your work and each other's work. I hope you're all well. I hope your family's well. If you need anything or have any immediate questions, feel free to send me a note. Other than that, I'll send you some Zoom links next week of when I'll be sitting in front of my computer with an open video waiting for you to step in and join us in the meeting.